Welcome to Story Reading. The 300 Peso Story. Emilio is a sister, Berta is a brother, and Anastasio is a younger brother. Main character. Emilio Perea was visiting his sister, Berta. Emilio said, just to save 1 peso, our brother, Anastasio, would let me starve. How do you know that, Emilio? Berta asked. I know it because of what happened yesterday, he answered. Emilio shook his head sadly and said, when we were children, Anastasio was different. Berta sighed. I remember those happy days very well. That was a long time ago. But tell me more about our brother. Why do you say he would let you starve? Well, this is what happened, said Emilio. I went to see Anastasio yesterday to ask him for a peso to buy medicine for my little boy, Pedro. Pedro has been sick for 3 days. He can't eat anything. Did he give you the peso? Asked Berta. No, he did not, said Emilio. He told me. You are wasting your breath, Emilio. Pedro is not my child. I'm not married. I don't have a child to worry about. Go away and don't bother me. That is what he said to me, Berta. Our brother is no good, said Berta. She sighed again. But don't worry. I'll give you a peso to get medicine for Pedro. Back to their brother, Anastasio Perea was walking across his cornfield. It had been a good year with a lot of rain. Anastasio saw that his crop was good and green, and he was certain that he would be paid well when it ripened in the fall. He had worked hard for that exact amount. He would have it soon because his crop was good, and he would sell it for a high price. High in the warm, blue sky, a crow flew over the field. It sped toward the dark mountains to the west. Anastasio shook his fist at the bird. My corn is not for you, he shouted. You are like my brother and my sister. You want to take what is mine. I have nothing to give to any of you. Then, as he often did, he thought back to the day when his plan although was born. He was a small boy and had asked the storekeeper, How come as you never work? I am the storekeeper, the man had replied in laughing. For several days, the young Anastasio thought about this amazing piece of information. His father worked hard in the fields, as did all of their neighbors. Again, he went to the storekeeper. How much money does it take to own a store? Oh, said the storekeeper, you need about 300 pesos to start. The storekeeper looked at the serious boy. But that is a lot of money, he warned. From that day, Anastasio set a goal for himself. He had to earn 300 pesos, but that was not easy to do. Although he held on to his money like a miser, he made some bad investments and was unlucky in some other business matters. One time someone stole money from his house. Since then he kept his pesos in a leather bag 50 under his shirt, tightly tied to his trouser belt. Now, Anastasio removed the leather bag from his belt and counted his money. He had 200 pesos. He would probably get 50 pesos more from the sale of his corn. He looked out across the field and was satisfied. Before you read Part 2, in Part 1 Emilio asked his brother Anastasio for 1 peso. How Anastasio refused to give him a peso. Do you think Emilio or Berta will ask their brother for money again? See if you are right. Part 2. That night there was a violent storm. Large pieces of hail fell over the village. The villagers declared that they had never seen hailstone as big as those. Windows were broken and trees were left bare. When the storm was over, all the corn in Anastasio's field was destroyed. Anastasio stood beside his field and wondered what to do. At that moment his brother, Emilio, came along. "Brother," said Emilio, "my corn is ruined too." It is a sad loss for us all. But corn is not everything in life. We can plant more corn. Come home with me and join us for a supper of tortillas and child. We can talk together then. Anastasio was angry. He wanted to put the blame for the hail on his brother. He felt that in some strange way Emilio was responsible for this loss. He thought to himself, if I had given Emilio money for his sick boy, would this have happened? He wondered about it. Anastasio became angrier. "Go home," he shouted at his brother. "I have no time to eat with you." A few weeks later, Anastasio planted his corn again. In July of that year, his sister, Berta, came to see him. She was thin and frail and seemed very uncomfortable. She sat down, pulling a thin, black shawl over her face and shoulders. Her small face stared out from under the shawl and made her look like a frightened, starving bird. Anastasio looked at her and wished that he had no relatives to bother him. It was obvious that his sister was in distress. "Why have you come here?" he asked harshly. He had decided to cut short their talk. "A tree fell on the roof of my casa." "So," said Anastasio. "We don't have the money to buy materials to make the repairs," Berta said. She paused, then went on. "If you can lend us a little money now, we will pay you back in a few weeks." Anastasio thought about the money he had of his pesos. He thought of the store he would own one day. "I don't have any money to give you," he said quickly. Then he added, "And I don't have enough room here for you and your husband. Anyway, I only have enough food for myself." Anastasio smiled and said, "Why don't you go to our brother, Emilio? Maybe he can give you some money. Maybe he can take you in." Berta stood up and silently left the house. As she walked away, the wind blew against her shawl and lifted it up above her shoulders. Her shadow on the ground looked like a huge black bird. Anastasio suddenly had a feeling that something bad was going to happen. He tried not to think about it. The next day, Anastasio discovered that his field had been invaded by a flock of wandering sheep. The entire crop of corn was ruined. The tender young plants had been eaten or crushed, and it was too late now to plant again. Later, Anastasio saw Berta on her way to the village. Emilio and his family were with her. Anastasio felt, somehow, that she was responsible for the ruined corn. Would things have been different if he had given her some money and allowed her to stay? He wondered about that. Anastasio looked bitterly in Berta's direction, but she did not see him. Her face was calm and peaceful. Before you read Part 3. In Part 1, Anastasio refused to give his brother Anastasio refused to lend his sister some money. Now Anastasio ready to go to the village to sell his crop. Do you think that the story will have a happy ending or a sad ending? See if you're right. Part 3. During the winter of that year, Anastasio earned 50 pesos by buying and then selling some horses. By spring, he had 250 pesos. He needed just 50 pesos more to have the amount he wanted. He did not see his brother or his sister anymore, but he heard from the neighbors that they were well and happy. "I hope they never bother me again," he said to himself. When spring came, the snow in the mountains melted and ran in streams down into the valleys. Then Anastasio planted his field. This time, Anastasio planted pinto beans. He had heard they would sell for a high price because there had been a shortage of pinto beans the season before. No one saw Anastasio all summer. He spent all of his time in the field. All day he worked in the field, and at night he slept there to guard it against sheep and other possible dangers. In the fall, Anastasio harvested his pinto beans. He put them in open wooden boxes and loaded them into his wagon. He had a large crop of fine beans ready to sell. He left for the village. He hoped to sell the beans for 50 pesos. This would give him the amount he needed, 300 pesos. At last, yes, it would be his best winter. He could buy a store with the money. On cold winter days, he would sit near the fire. He would have very little work to do and plenty to eat. Although he had pleasant thoughts, Anastasio was not a happy man. Many things bothered him. He would have to guard his store very carefully, and he was worried about Berta and Emilio. They would think he was making a large profit. They would beg him for money. They would think that the food in his grocery store was free. They would think he should share it with them. Yes, all of these things worried Anastasio. Anastasio drove along a narrow, winding road. It rose higher and higher before it descended into the valley where he planned to sell his beans. Anastasio finally reached the top of the road. His horses were exhausted from pulling the heavy load. But Anastasio was impatient to get to the valley. He started down at once, urging on his tired horses with a snap of the reins. Anastasio turned around a curve as he went downhill. Suddenly yelled, he was struck from behind by a fast-moving horseless wagon. The driver did not see Anastasio in time to stop. He hit the back of Anastasio's wagon, breaking off the piece of wood that held the boxes of beans in place. This frightened the horses. They jumped up, tipped the wagon, and threw Anastasio into the air. He fell heavily against the trunk of a tree, hitting his head and his chest with great force. The frightened horses ran wildly along the road and scattered beans everywhere. Anastasio was dazed, but he looked ahead and saw that the horses had finally stopped by some trees near the home of his brother, Emilio. Anastasio turned around. He saw that, except for the broken board, the wagon was not damaged. The horses did not seem to be hurt either. This was good, but he had lost his crop again. All of his boxes had been thrown out of the wagon. Beans were all over the ground and in the ditch next to the road. At this moment, the man in the horseless wagon returned. He apologized for causing the accident. Then he saw all the beans along the road and asked how much they were worth. 50 pesos, gasped the unhappy Anastasio. It's a deal, said the traveler, handing over the money. He was glad to pay this amount and avoid further trouble. Anastasio Perea was satisfied. When he was alone again, he took the leather bag from his belt. He held the bag in one hand and the 50 pesos in the other. There were 250 pesos in the bag, and now he had 50 pesos more. He could buy the store at last. He was a rich man. He sighed and sat down on the stump of a tree. His head ached and his chest burned from the blow he had received. It was so hard. Suddenly he fell forward and lay very still in the warm sunshine. 3 large, black birds circled slowly above him. Anastasio's horses stopped a short distance from a field where Emilio and Berta were working. It was a warm morning, the crop was good, and they were very happy. "Look," shouted Emilio, "those are our brother's horses." "But where is Anastasio?" asked Berta. "Let's go and see," said Emilio. They hurried up the road together. Soon they came to the body of their brother. It was lying so still, they knew he was dead. "Per Anastasio," exclaimed Emilio, "what terrible thing has happened to you?" "Per brother," cried Berta, "I remember when you were a little boy, how we loved you then." Emilio took the money bag and the pesos from his brother's clenched hands. Emilio gave the money bag to Berta and looked at the pesos. "There's so much money here," he said when he had finished counting. 50 pesos. Berta opened the bag and took out the money. 250 pesos more, she gasped in astonishment. 300 pesos, they exclaimed together. "What a beautiful funeral he will have." Your guess, is it right thought about?